All right. Hi, this is Jon Reed, Diginomic. I'm joined by Denise Holt. After a long wait, I was really hoping to get back with you because you really shook up the Constellation Connected Enterprise event in November with some really dynamic, interesting ideas about active inference AI and how different it is than the current generative AI paradigms that everyone seems to be rushing to adopt despite their flaws. So, hi, welcome.
Hi, John. Thank you for having me on today. I appreciate it. It's nice
Yeah, this
to.
is kind of it's kind of spontaneous because we were just kind of doing a catch up, but I was like, let's do a quick taping because you also then came back to Constellation because Ray and his team had another AI summit, a bit of a smaller one, and I'd love to ask you about that. And I also want to do a few updates because there's been a lot going on in your work since we last talked. So, can you tell me first, like, just um, joining this like interesting group of like really brilliant, eccentric AI people at this recent Constellation event. What was the general vibe? One of the reasons I'm curious is like, are people like getting frustrated with some of the overhype around the current LLM agents? Are they looking for new approaches? Like, what was the mood there?
You know, I that was only my second event with
Uh-huh.
Constellation Research, and I loved it. And I'm really grateful to Ray and his team for inviting me into this. Like you said, this is a really unique room of some brilliant people. So you do get kind of a sense of where people are at, and people are excited about AI. um, there was a lot more talk about kind of how to go from where we are now. I think the consensus is that generative AI takes you just so far. So then how do you overcome that? And it's actually kind of fun too because when our friend Esteban Kolsky, when he was up on stage, or when David
Oh
Bray was
yeah.
up on stage, they would be saying things and then they would go, and there's also potential for active inference, and we have Denise here. So they gave me a lot of love, which was actually really fun. And so I think that there is this kind of sense of what is next. And right after that event, I went out to South by Southwest, and I was on a panel there where that was the entire theme of the panel is beyond generative AI, what is next? And um I think people know that something has to be next. And
Yeah.
they're open to it.
Yeah, and for folks that don't know, like Esteban Kolsky and David Bray. I mean, Esteban in particular, I've done podcasts with him. You should check out about active inference. But Esteban's a real AI grouch in the sense that he studied AI for a long time, and he feels like generative AI is largely on the wrong track, and he's got his reasons for that. But if you can win their seal of approval, listen to Denise, then like that's pretty good because those are some cantankerous fellows that really know their stuff. And I think it's a really interesting time in enterprise AI because I'm spending a lot of time trying to help customers understand really precisely what the pros and cons of large language models and generative AI are. And the reason I'm doing that is because so many companies are pressing ahead with use cases. Some of them are investing on their own. A lot of them are starting to absorb the functionality from all the vendors, whether it's the Adobes and the Workdays and the Salesforces or smaller vendors. They're all embedding all of this stuff into their product, and yet a lot of times the fine print doesn't really get discussed very openly. So, for example, like I've spent a lot of time looking at how you get from kind of a more generic LLM architecture to a much more accurate one through the use of techniques like fine tuning and RAG. But I've also looked at what the problems are there. So, for example, vendors don't volunteer the information that the LLM is ultimately a probabilistic engine. And if you can have this fantastic customer data coming in through the context window through RAG, for example, or you can have an LLM cross-check another LLM, which is largely what reasoning is currently the way they describe it, quote unquote. But these things get you further along from a 70 or 80% result more to a 95, but they don't get you to 100 necessarily a lot of times. And that's a real problem in terms of use case design. And so what I'm trying to do on the one hand is really help customers understand what the real pros and cons are. but I also want them to spend a little bit of time thinking about what's next. Because while there are some cool use cases with the current technology, if you impose that kind of architectural discipline and governance and all the stuff that we write about on Diginomica, but there's limits too, and those limits aren't going to be quickly fixed. And that's why I think the approaches you're advocating are so interesting, because they do two things. They shine a light on the flaws of the current approaches, but they also show new approaches that have a really different upside, I guess you could say. So why don't you talk just a little bit for folks who aren't as familiar about the power of this? And as you and I were talking about, it's a combination of this active inference methodology, but also the development of the spatial web protocol. Can you just say why this matters in the field of AI and why you're so passionate about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, when you talk about, I'll get into how it works in a second, but just the benefits alone from this particular methodology versus, the machine learning, deep learning, um, it's way more energy efficient. It mimics biological intelligence. So, when you just think of how, the human brain takes, about 20 watts of power to work, versus what's required to run these super powered GPUs in these giant databases. And it's such a striking difference. And the fact that when you're able to break these agents away from having to compute and signal back to the mothership, and it can actually be out in the wild computing at the edge, where it needs to be locally, and distributing the power resources required to all edge devices. There's a lot more power in that. And then, these agents work as kind of this multi-agent collective intelligence system then, right? So the way active inference works is these agents, they have a sense of self in the world, right? So they require this kind of grounding layer, this world model. That's where the spatial web protocol comes in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But, given the fact that they have this context layer to pull from wherever they are in their environment within the network, then they can start to, uh, explore their environment, learn more about their environment to whatever their objective is in the moment. So whatever you're building this agent to do, or to seek out, or how, to monitor, to operate, whatever, then these agents actually are able to ping their environment to gather more evidence, more information, sensory data back, right? That sensory data comes back to them, and then they're able to measure it against what they've learned so far, what they know to be true so far. And that can come from the context layer. That can come from all their past dealings, right? They're what they've learned up until that point. And it's this constant feedback loop, this action perception feedback loop of pinging the environment to gather more evidence, measuring it against their world model, either updating it or confirming it. But that space between that uncertainty that is there, it's this action perception loop that closes the gap on that uncertainty. So it's kind of an error correction mechanism, right?
Mm.
Its whole entire process closes the gap on uncertainty and increases the probability for success, the probability for you know, uh, uh, successful conclusions, successful outputs. So these agents, the way they learn about their environment through that type of a mechanism, they also can share beliefs with each other and learn from each other the same way. So that's what I mean when you get this multi-scale intelligence from multiples of agents that are kind of growing their knowledge and able to work together. And that's where you get the ability to have these agents, like if you have it, say, across a supply chain, all the way from raw materials through to manufacturing, straight through to distribution, you can have these agents deployed where they're able to understand everything at a local level, simultaneously understanding what's happening at a global level and all scales in between. And, you know, those the there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, for sure. And for listeners, I'm sure we're going to open up a big can of worms on a lot of topics that will leave you with a lot of questions. So, one way to think about this is that this active inference AI methodology has actually been under development for a long time. And if you do some searches on Dr. Carl Friston, who is connected to the company Versus now, for example, great YouTube videos he's appeared on that kind of define what active inference, what the vision of it is, what the biological inspiration was, and how it manifests in AI, and this whole real time situational awareness. But then the other component, right, Denise, is that every type of AI desperately needs more real world grounding, right? And
Right.
that's a big problem with LLMs as well. And you've touched on a lot of this in a recent blog post on your site. So folks that want to check that out, it's called The Dawn of True Agency, and I'll include a link, but why active inference is surpassing LLMs and shaping the future. But the rise of the spatial web as the world model that active inference relies on was a big breakthrough. And this was a public protocol released by Versus, I guess, what was it, a year ago? How long ago was this
So it
initially?
was voted and approved internally through the IEEE last summer. And over the
Okay.
last several months, it's just been in its final administrative, where people can still pose a few questions and then they're answered in committees. And it's just those things that are voted on because the overall draft itself has been approved. So it's just this final administration activity that's been happening, but I expect that it's going to be released anytime. And I've been a member of a voting member of that IEEE group for the last 3 years. The protocol itself has been in development for, I want to say 5, 6 years. So
Right. And
wow.
so essentially there's a big convergence of elements going on in this active
Mm.
inference field right now. You've released a bunch of courses that you can get certified in, which is very cool. So the educational component is coming up because I think so much about good AI is about the community and ecosystem that develops around the AI to build upon it, right? And so starting to see that is starting to take shape, right? And so Versus, I think you mentioned that they have their first release is it Genius? Is that what it's called?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
and there's there's some companies that are in some form of beta at the moment with that. So that's percolating along. So it feels like this is shaping up to be a pretty big year to kind of prove out some of the things you're advocating for here.
Yeah, it's my understanding. So, Versus has had a lot of, you know, um, big companies, Fortune 500 companies, various industries from pharmaceuticals to, all kinds, NASA, JPL, Volvo. They've had a lot of these beta partners and pilot partners, and then they opened up their beta to the wider developer community last summer. So they've onboarded quite a few beta partners. It's my understanding that those are converting to contract next month, and then next month, so April, is when they're going to start rolling out their commercial release of Genius. And I think they're starting enterprise first, and then by sometime summer, maybe late summer, then it'll start rolling out more to the public. But the commercial release is a really important milestone here because I think that we're going to start then seeing a lot of use cases and having a lot more news about that come out. And that's going to be pretty fascinating to see how people have been using it and, you know, what that looks like.
Yeah, and your blog post is interesting because it definitely helps me with some proof points to sort of criticize today's AI technology in terms of the limitations. Like you talk about how a new digital transformation is upon us, incorporating adaptive intelligence, automation, and spatial computing. And here comes the criticism. This isn't about more sophisticated chatbots or better pattern matching or even attempting explainability using LLMs. It's about the emergence of autonomous intelligent systems that possess true agency, the ability to autonomously act in the moment based on real world situational awareness. And you go on a little bit further there to talk about some of the current limitations in large language models around predicting words, not decisions, static knowledge, lack of perception, lack of causal reasoning. Some of those things are arguably being modestly addressed, such as the static knowledge thing has been dealt with through sort of more real-time inference mechanisms. But you say LLMs can automate tasks, but they're not capable of making autonomous decisions that require real-world situational awareness. And the thing I like about that is that poses a direct challenge to a lot of the sort of promotional material out there that LLMs can do that now. So I think that's really interesting. And look, I mean, I don't know where this is all going to land. I think every technology we've talked about so far has a lot to prove, but these feel to me to be very healthy arguments to keep minds open.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
So if listeners are interested in learning more and getting more involved in this, what would you suggest as a next step?
Well, I mean, do your research. And there's a lot of research out there, a lot of these research papers. I actually, along with the courses that I've developed, I launched an education hub in mid-January that, I really developed it so that it could be kind of a global education hub around these technologies, active inference AI and spatial web technologies. And what I mean by spatial web technologies is the protocol HSTP and HSML, and all these emerging technologies that can now converge together through this protocol, right? So, like IoT and distributed ledger technologies, AR, VR, all of it. And so, as you know, Jon, there's a lot of noise in this space. So I really wanted this to be a hub where people could find the research specific to these technologies, could find each other and connect with each other and find people to collaborate who are also interested in these technologies. So, I really want to find resources, everything else. And then, obviously my courses are there too. But, this is a real opportunity for people to be able to, collaborate and cut out kind of the noise of everything else and really dig in and see what this is all about.
So a couple of really interesting aspects to active inference, and I don't know how well all of this is going to pan out in terms of real world adoption, but if it does pan out, the decentralized aspect's really interesting for a couple of reasons. I think a lot of us are eager to see a future that isn't controlled by a handful of very rich individuals. I'm being very kind with my language. I'm not using the word oligarch, but a lot of us want a more decentralized experience on this planet and more self-directed in our technological future. So, but also I think just from a practical perspective, a lot of the best AI is going to be edge case type stuff that's going to need more decentralized computing. So that's one cool thing. The other thing is the energy consumption potential here of much reduced energy consumption for better AI performance. I think those are really interesting things, and that's one reason why, while I don't know how this is going to pan out, I'm really rooting for you and this whole community because I think those are potent. I mean, feel free to comment, but I think those are really important characteristics.
They are, and there's the safety benefit of it too. That I definitely want to mention that because you know, right now, I think one of the biggest problems with a lot of the AI and the emerging technologies that we're using is we're trying to use them in the most unsecured environment, the World Wide Web. Where hacking, tracking, faking are rampant and you can't tell the difference. And, one thing about the Spatial Web Protocol, HSTP, is, you know, security is baked in and the framework itself offers security because, right now, when you go to a website, right, and you're transacting with a platform on a website, all of the transactions are taking place under the umbrella of whatever centralized authority owns that site, that domain. But with this, with the spatial web expanding into spatial domains where every person, place, or thing in any space and nested spaces can all become domains. They're locatable, identifiable, they are programmable. And the programming can be attributes, all kinds of attributes that change over time, like even, even things like sentiment or pressure or, temperature, all aspects of these things in their spaces and how they relate to each other, but also permissions, required credentials, things like that. So now transactions are at every touch point wherever you want them to be in these spaces. So you can really bake in guardrails around your data. You can have nuanced guardrails there, right? You can set expirations on permissions. Right now, permissions are yes or no. And if you say no, you're opting out, right? Here, you're able to actually, it puts the power back into the hands of the user on, how their data is being used. And then it puts the power in the hands of whoever owns those domains on how the data can be interacted with, right? So, and it enables this zero knowledge proof environment too. So when you think about you know, uh, kind of faking and all of that kind of stuff, I think, we're still going to see things like that, but it'll be really clear it's not the person, right? So it'll become more of a parody, like an SNL thing, right? Where it's obvious that this is a skit, or not a skit, but you know what I mean? Like it's a parody. It's not real. It's not that person that is doing this. So, and I think that's something that will help secure a lot of these technologies.
So one of my goals with this podcast was to blow people's minds a little bit in terms of a lot of the assumptions that they might have around how AI works, because I really want folks to think about there's so much that can be done and created and realized with AI that is not part of what we're talking about now. And when we hear from the keynote stage, like the keynotes I heard today, and I won't name the vendors, but you know who I'm talking about. So there's a whole lot more going on. And yet there's something else I want to point out, which is even though this what you're doing contrasts against some of the limitations of current LLM approaches and stuff. In fact, the tools you're working on can work in conjunction with LLM environments. And I think one of the most interesting things about looking forward to AI is not about throwing out one thing for another. It's about creating compound systems that leverage strengths of different aspects of AI for a better benefit, right? So my biggest problem with LLMs a lot of times is putting them in control of things they shouldn't be in control of, rather than essentially putting them in their place for what they're good at and taking advantage of that, because they are good at a lot of things. So
Yeah.
so an active inference agent, for example, as you were describing, can utilize an LLM. So it's not like throwing away today's architecture necessarily. In fact, this could actually, for some companies, be a bit of an evolution, right, in what they're currently doing, rather than
This
saying,
can
"Oh, you
provide
have
a
to throw it all
management.
out." Yeah,
Yeah, this can provide a management layer. It can
right.
provide the ability for these active inference agents. The LLMs can inherit benefits like the explainability and the safety aspects and different things like that. And one of the other things too with HSML, you can actually take human laws and guidelines and then make them programmable so that AI understands and can abide in real time. And this has already been proven in use cases. Um, there was a drone project, like 3-year project with the European Union, and there were, I think, 8 countries involved. And it was taking these drones and taking HSML, and it's like, okay, well, can we put the airspace laws and anything that's changing, you cross country borders, all of the laws change. Can we take this human, law space and make it to where these AI can understand and abide in real time? And every time they did. And they were doing all kinds of use cases like, medical supply delivery, perimeter security, all kinds of things. But that's a pretty exciting aspect, because then you're talking about an AI that can be governed on the front end rather than trying to correct mistakes on the back end.
Mm.
And there's a lot of power there. when you're talking about wanting AI that can kind of grow alongside humans, right? Like we can grow in collaboration with human and machine versus just trying to react to whatever these machines are doing.
Really like it. Some of longtime Diginomica readers probably know that I got a little over enthusiastic about blockchain too early on. And ever since then, I've said I'm not going to be a technology evangelist and promoter anymore. My job is different. I like evangelists and advocates, but my job is to drill into these things and document how they work, how they fail, how they succeed, and especially the customer use cases. So I'm really looking forward in the next year, hopefully, to talking to a couple of live projects as they emerge from their different internal testing. And of course, sometimes it's hard to get people to talk on the record and stuff. So it may take a while. Like for example, major international companies using this are not going to like sit down with me in the next month. But the point is, there's a lot of this stuff going on right now, and that's going to be really interesting to document because that's how I develop confidence is through the combination of a bustling ecosystem and community, and then the live projects. And you've done a good job of sharing a couple of examples in the real world. Are there any other real world examples before we wrap that you think are really interesting for this technology?
Um, yeah, I mean, just what it can do for automation with smart city infrastructure, what it can do.
Smart cities. Yeah, we should talk about that briefly. Smart cities is one of the coolest use cases for this, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to become one of the most pervasive as far as we'll really start to understand the power of this. I mean, I think enterprise are going to start using it and they'll start understanding it within their own ecosystems and their partner systems and their industries. So we'll see that build out too, right? But also, I mean, Versus is partnered with Analog and they are part of the Abu Dhabi Smart City project, right? And Abu Dhabi has claimed that they will have 100% AI governed smart city by 2027. And so so it's interesting, when you think of that of the power of automation. And I know with a lot of smart city efforts, one of the biggest problems with using, current AI has been the fact that it's not trustworthy. It's really hard. You need these systems to be able to operate at the edge. That's where they're needed when they're internal inside of you know, automated infrastructure. And they also need to be able to deal with real live data in the moment. So you have to have agents that can do that. And that just doesn't happen with LLMs or machine learning tools. They operate off of known data, and so these systems are able to actually monitor traffic, monitor systems within systems, uh, understand complex systems on a local scale as well as a global scale, and collaborate with each other. So eh, yeah, it's going to be really fun to watch these smart cities start to build out with this type of automation. And I think it's going to change our lives. I mean, the way we kind of live and breathe and work, I see it going through a massive change over just the next couple of years.
Indeed. Well, and I don't know if I'm going to move to Abu Dhabi just yet, but I might be in for a visit in a couple of years. That could be pretty darn interesting. So
You know what
anyway,
I think they're targeting there is because they're not bogged down by a lot of legacy systems, right? It's pretty
right.
easy to go in and start, building these newer systems because it's relatively newer infrastructure, and I think that could become the blueprint then for other cities around the world to go, okay, it works, it's proven,
I live 2 hours west of Boston, which learned some painful lessons the last couple decades about trying to modernize on top of a legacy infrastructure in an urban environment. Man, if we could whiteboard our cities, that would be pretty cool. But anyway, the next best thing would be technologies like this. So that's super interesting. And I appreciate your willingness to engage in the back and forth and my occasional grouchiness around next gen tools and technologies. But really going to wish you good luck and look forward to keeping track of this story and having dialogue about these possibilities because I think it's the right conversation to be having. So good job.
Thank you so much, Jon. And I appreciate it. I appreciate you. And this was fun. And,
Yep.
happy to have a conversation like this anytime.
Cool. Until next time, then. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks, Jon.